Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched Arsenic and Old Lace from 1994. Now, you'll notice that I am padding out the sort of spooky season of movies because I wanted to get I wanted to get more in during the month of October. We are now well into November when this will release, so we're just gonna let that pass by. I wanted one more for the road, and so I was reminded recently that this movie is actually kind of a horror film and is also set on Halloween. So I thought it would be a perfect way to cap things off. However, that does lead me straight into talking about the film, because this film is many things, but I would hesitate to call it horror or related to Halloween in particular. But we'll get into the details of that later. This is a movie that I've heard people talk about every now and then, but isn't super well remembered, it seems. And that's despite the fact that both it and the play, the theater play that it was based on, did quite well at the time. But admittedly, that was also now 80 years ago. So, people have short historical memories when it comes to media and other things. This is a really interesting film that I did not expect to be what it is at all. And based on some of the other films that I've talked about before and that we've watched on this show, I was not super enthused about watching a Cary Grant picture, to be perfectly honest. As I've mentioned before, I think he's fine. I don't think he's in a lot of ways particularly exceptional. But what's very interesting is this is a movie where he plays a very different kind of, not only a very different kind of character, but one that is animated and acted in a way that is deliberately not just a different character, but like a different style of portrayal. This is Cary Grant's character is an exaggeration of what the character should be, because at its core, this is really a comedy film. It's basically a comedy of errors. And that gets into a whole kind of unpacking of this film and what it is. Because it's not that great at being a comedy of errors. It's almost there. And that's not to say that it's a bad film either. It's just one that is doing many, many things all at the same time in a way that is sometimes kind of baffling. The cast overall is fantastic. This is a fairly short cast list. The setting is basically limited to one room for the most part, one building, and mostly a single room. And that goes back to how, this would have been adapted from the theater. We'll get into talking about the adaptation and how it works and how it doesn't later, but I like how they've kept it concise. There are lots of theater adaptations that become sprawling very quickly. And for the most part, this one keeps it to more or less in and around a single set because that's what works for it. This isn't a movie that's going to be about showing off the most that they can do with all these different styles of shooting, indoor, outdoor, massive sets, those sorts of things, which are often the hallmarks of really memorable and really big films in this era. This is still in many ways a fledgling era for cinema, and so the tropes are less established, the money is less present, everything's a lot more kind of done seat of the pants. What's notable as well is the director, Frank Capra, is a very well-known in cinematic circles, a well-known director. I don't know if we've talked about him before because I don't think we've watched. I feel like maybe we watched one of his other films on the show before, but I can't remember what it was. He's a pretty good director, and this is still like sort of, I want to say fairly early in his career. Don't quote me on that, though. I should have double checked that before I got into it. But his name being on here is just fascinating as a contextual reference to the industry at the time that this was made and what it was before and after. This is also fairly early for Cary Grant. He, would have his career go on all the way through the 60s. And while he was not a young man in this film, I want to say he was in his 30s. I could probably double check that real quick. But let's see, he was born in 1904. So he's like 36, 30, he's 40. Okay, he's 40. So he's not a young man here, but it's still not that late in his career. This is not the movie he's most remembered for, and often the ones that he is most remembered for are ones that are into the late 40s, into the 50s, and even the 60s are some of his most memorable ones. And so seeing him play into this screwball archetype is really interesting, especially because he plays basically the straight man in the comedy. He's, the one who is, if you're not familiar with the terminology, the straight man is the one who doesn't understand the jokes that are going on, or is the sort of either the butt of the joke, or is the one reacting to the jokes because of the absurd scenario. So he's placed in this setting as the straight man who is reacting to all of the other characters who are doing various wacky things. And he plays it up really well. It's very hammy, and it works very well towards that more comedic aspect of it. What's interesting, though, is that this is not, to me, a very laugh out loud film. And I've been trying to unpack why I think that is. I've watched this a couple of days ago now. Because at its core, as you describe the film, as you describe it, individual scenes and even interactions, this is a very funny film. But it did not make me laugh that hard. And I think a lot of that comes down to issues in the presentation and a lack of surety in the tone and the way to shoot certain elements. I'm going to be really careful not to talk about basically any of the plot here, because I think it's super fun to watch it unfold and to have all the various reveals done time after time throughout this entire film. This is a kind of a crazy plot that goes all over the place, mostly played for comedic reasons and, various tensions and that kind of thing. But it's not without its value and its fun reveals. And at the same time, it still manages to maintain a pretty good pacing all the way throughout. Even with ups and downs in terms of the pacing it's trying to have, like, it's moving at a clip. You are never left breathing room to really process what happened in the last scene. And that works that mostly works in its advantage. Not that it has anything to hide necessarily, but merely because it's sort of, because of the nature of it being this screwball, comedy of errors. The point of the last scene was not that, you need to pick out every detail in it. The point of the last scene was that it is absurd and that it is comedic in its absurdity. So moving in that fast pace is kind of key. However, this movie incorporates, even for 44, incorporates a lot of tropes and styles of other genres of production, especially horror stuff, to the point that it has several running gags that are direct, explicit references to either other people or other properties that are in and around the horror genre. Again, things I'm not going to spoil here. And this is where I very first started to key into what was not working for me, or what was making me not laugh, is the horror elements are done too well. They are presented with a level of production quality and stylistic intention that makes them play like true, like dramatic horror scenes. They are not silly enough. They're not slapstick enough. They're not interrupted often enough with those comedic elements that allow you to sort of break the tension. And so rather than being a pastiche, it's a little bit too easy to fall into, like, the production quality is too high. So you end up accidentally falling into the feeling of, oh no, we are genuinely supposed to be, not laughing at this and actually fearful or surprised or in danger and those sorts of things. I sort of keyed in on that as I was watching some of the sort of the scenes in the midpoint of the film, where it starts to ramp up some of those things a bit further. But this runs throughout the course of the film as a problem. And it's only in thinking about it just like today, basically, that I realized that part of the problem is in this adaptation. This, as I said, was a theater production. And when you're watching the theater, you watch the whole stage. You have your focus in one place at a time, usually. You might be watching an entire ensemble that's filling the whole stage or something like that. But for a production like this, where you have a fairly short cast, you have a stage that is unchanging and very highly built. Basically, I'm assuming, I wasn't there in 1941 to see the original run of the theater production, but I'm assuming that it basically would have been an iteration of the same set that is used in this film, some version of the same kind of thing, but on a full stage. And so when you have a production like that, you're watching the entire stage at once. So as I'm thinking through what would this have looked like on a theater stage, I'm realizing that this is where the style of the cinematography in this film probably does it a massive disservice. Theater also has the advantage, and also up until very recently, cinema also had this same kind of thing going on, where it's a collective watching experience, whether you want it to be or not. You're not watching a movie alone. That's unthinkable in 1944. Nobody has that kind of money. Same with theater. And so you're having a collective watching experience with other people in the theater with you. And so if other people laugh, you're more likely to laugh as well. You're more likely to react to things. This is the reason why sitcoms in the 90s and 2000s have a lot of laugh tracks. It's because it's basically trying to trigger the same emotional responses, for better or for worse. But it is a genuine, emotional response that people normally have. So what we have here, unfortunately for me, is I'm watching the film not in a theater full of people, and I'm watching a version of the theater production that has been focused for cinema. So you have a lot of close-up shots, insert shots, and sometimes panning, sometimes set shots where you just have sort of an insert or just a framed shot of a specific part of the stage, so to speak. And that does a disservice to both the framing and the pacing of this film. I have to imagine that a theatrical production of this would be given much more leeway in its timing, because there are way too many, and the way I'm coming to this basically is there are a lot of scenes and shots in this film that are kind of funny on their own. But if you think about them in the context of the full stage, where you could have people standing around not doing things, basically observing as additional observers to what's going on in one part of the stage, that can add to the comedy massively. If it's just this one corner of the stage, this one edge, this one, table or whatever, where the action is happening, and everybody else gets to see and react to it. So the absurdity of seeing some of the things that happen is heightened. It's no longer a close-up shot of a scary face in the dark. It's a scary face in the dark in the context of there's 5 other people in the room bumbling around, bumping into things, like having their own reactions, and you can look over to them and say, "Oh, look, they're not taking this that seriously either." So that gives the ability to give context to a very dramatic performance that maintains that sort of comedic aspect of it. And so ultimately, while I think this is a pretty funny film at its core, the focus on cinematic excellence harms the comedy. So overall, the production is done very well, but for all the wrong reasons. I hope that explanation makes sense. If you've seen the film, I think it will make more sense, because there are many of these scenes that are extremely dramatic. And again, that goes to the quality of the production, because I don't want to say this as a negative to the film, because it is done well. In the context of another film that was not a comedy, these very dramatic shots, very dramatic performances, very good use of lighting throughout this entire film, use of the very excellent use of the set as a character in and of itself, and even things like the costuming, the makeup. It all plays off each other beautifully and largely for comedy. But I just you get to the end of the film, or I got to the end of the film. My understanding is a lot of people think this is a very funny film. You get to the end of the film and it feels like it's been kind of an emotional roller coaster, where you go from, at the very beginning, it looks like it's going to be like the very first scene makes it feel like it's going to be a romantic screwball comedy from the 40s or 50s, and that's immediately thrown away to go off on this wild goose chase through all these different genres, all these different emotional feelings in various scenes, and performances that are all extremely good, but in context often sort of end up clashing with each other. But with that said, credit on basically all levels here. I think the casting is fantastic. Some of the performances are really funny, and I am actually surprised I wasn't laughing more. I'm gonna have to rewatch this one, is basically what it comes down to, because, as I said, it's like a breakneck pace. So even if I wasn't already, a little bit befuddled by the plot itself, then there's this emotional roller coaster that goes through it as well. Anyway, this is a really interesting film that is not at all what I would have expected from it, or really from anything of this era. I'm fascinated by it. As I've mentioned before, I love theater, and I love theater adaptations and seeing how those things work. So this one's really interesting, and in addition to rewatching this, I'm probably going to see if I can find a recorded performance of the theater play, because not from the era, I'm sure that doesn't exist, but I'm sure people have put on modern performances of the play, and I'd love to see what that looks like, and whether some of my suspicions about the timing and pacing and how jokes overlapping and stuff could make this lighten up a bit. I'm fascinated how that would potentially work out. Anyway, this is not really a Halloween film, I would argue, but it is still appropriate for the season, and I'm fascinated by it. I think you should go check this out if any of what I've talked about is remotely interesting to you. It's just a fascinating production. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.